Good evening, and welcome to the Australian and New Zealand Environmental History Network Conference for 2020. I'm Dr. Margaret Cook, and I am joining you from the lands of the Yagara people in Ipswich, Queensland, and I acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, as well as those of the lands from where you are joining us. I'd now like to welcome our speaker, Daniel May. Thank you.
Lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people and acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. During and following our most recent bushfire season, there's been increased interest at a public, academic and political level in the burning practices of Aboriginal Australians. Much of this interest has been driven by the publication and circulation of Bill Gammage's The Biggest Estate on Earth. Tonight, I'm going to try and argue that Gammage's thesis can be productively read as what I call a grand unified theory of Indigenous environmental impact, which just really rolls off the tongue. And I'm going to try and link it to earlier grand unified theories proposed by Tim Flannery and Paul Martin to explain the extinction of Pleistocene megafauna. So by grand theory, I mean a theory that places enormous causal emphasis upon a single factor across a vast scope. These theories are subject to similar sorts of tropes going on. They're similarly proposed with eyes to the present, and they've all had demonstrable cultural and political impacts. Most especially tonight, I'm going to try and experiment by arguing that these theories have been hamstrung by conceptualising discourses of Indigenous environmental impact within binaries. So I'm going to try and resolve this by adapting and building upon another grand unified theory as a constructive way of moving past such unproductive discussions. I'm hoping to submit this as a paper, so I'd appreciate any thoughts that you've got to offer. Okay, so I imagine most people have read The Biggest Estate on Earth, but if not, basically an analysis of the thesis matters because there's little doubt that it's had a major impact on how settler Australians understand both Indigenous Australia at a general level and Indigenous burning. So there's tons of work on this. I've found huge amounts of it. I found many of the survivors of the 2009 Black Saturday bushfires have referenced Gammage's thesis in their memoirs. It's continually discussed in the academic and policy fire world. It goes on and on. The thesis itself is beguilingly simple. The chief ally for Indigenous Australians before colonisation was fire. A single unifying ecological philosophy enforced by religious sanction compelled Indigenous Australians to care for country. Gammage positions his thesis as saying Australia was no wilderness, but rather a managed landscape, a huge continental estate maintained by fire. Templates were repeated across the continent as means were local and ends were universal, and this ensured the predictable utilisation of resources. As much as I admire it, I have a lot of critiques of Gammage's thesis, but those most pertinent tonight to my identification of it as a grand unified theory is the manner in which it implies universality of Indigenous burning. So the thesis fails to discuss or make room for variation in Indigenous burning practices across time. Gammage very specifically fixes Indigenous burning at 1788, failing to discuss the evidence from, say, pollen and charcoal cores, which show significant changes in burning patterns over the last 50,000 years. Similarly, the thesis, particularly through its deployment of Gammage's template concept, implies universal burning patterns across space, which historian Grace Karskens has quite aptly characterised as slippage. Such universality leaves no role for variation in Indigenous burning practices or for a natural role for high-intensity bushfires. This contradicts, say, oral evidence from the Ngaju people of the Great Western Woodlands in WA or charcoal evidence from the mountain ash forests in Victoria. It's in this way that the thesis presents a unified theory of grand scope that fails to take into account local spatial or temporal variations in favour of proving one side of a binary argument. A chief ally was fire versus a wilderness. Now, in addition to this, Tim Neal has critiqued Gammage's thesis as contributing to a discourse that authorises an eco-modernist imaginary of control over bushfire, or in other words, giving its readers the impression that natural factors which drive high-intensity bushfire can be rendered completely benign. I agree with this critique, and I found a great deal of evidence that Gammage's thesis has been mobilised in support of arguments that reflect just those attitudes, most prominently through calls for greater prescribed burning. Gammage's thesis shares similar features with earlier theories about the extinction of Pleistocene megafauna, as other scholars have already pointed out. For those who are unfamiliar with these theories, essentially in many areas across the globe, many species of large animals, 40 kilos or heavier, went extinct at roughly the same time as humans appeared to spread throughout those regions. However, there's a bit of a lack of clear evidence that these animals disappeared because they were hunted or overhunted. The most famous overhunting theory tried to actually incorporate this lack of evidence, which is a bit of a neat argumentative trick when you think about it. Paul Martin argued that megafauna in North America, across the globe, were so naive about the threat posed by these new humans that they were able to be wiped out in an extremely rapid blitzkrieg. So rapid that archaeological evidence did not accumulate and survive to the present day. Martin's theory was then adapted by Tim Flannery for Australia, who argued that Indigenous burning had developed as a response to the overhunting blitzkrieg in Australia. According to Flannery, the megafauna had previously recycled nutrients and consumed biomass, the other way around. With them gone, fire stick farming was developed as a substitute. It was a way to fill in for the megafauna's actions in reducing fuel loads and recycling nutrients. Now, there are evidentiary problems with both of those rather dated theories, which I won't go into, but it's sufficient to say that the competing explanation at the time was usually taken to be climatic or environmental changes. So both Martin's and Flannery's theses then undoubtedly qualify as grand unified theories. Both have astounding ambition in terms of the scope. Both rely upon monocausal explanations as they position themselves on one side of a very specific binary: human impact versus natural impact in shaping environments. Martin's theory in particular appeals to a trope of humans as inherently destructive, which explains its popularity in high school textbooks and so on. Martin's theory has been used to mobilise against arguing granting hunting rights to contemporary Native Americans. Tim Flannery's thesis has been drawn upon lots of ways in Australia. I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with the mid-1990s Farmers Federation pamphlet, which identified modern farmers clearing native vegetation as the heirs of Flannery's fire stick farmers. So all three theories can be identified as grand unified theories which rely upon binaries. I think there's a way forward here that incorporates a theory, another theory, proposed by the American geographer Thomas Vale. Vale's theory appears in an edited collection which sought to ask, was Native American burning critical to the appearance of the American West before the arrival of Columbus? So we can see here, Vale's proposed what I characterise as a spectrum model to try and determine the impact of Indigenous burning practices. He conceived of 7 levels of Indigenous impact, ranging from intensely humanised landscapes to untouched landscapes. Vale's actual use of the model has, again, all sorts of issues I won't go into. It was effectively a defence of wilderness. But in concept, as a concept, I think it's illuminating because it moves away from the binaries of Indigenous environmental impact. So I'm really trying to experiment around this idea of the spectrum and how useful it can be. For the mathematically inclined, I propose an addition to Vale's spectrum. Rather than a one-dimensional axis ranging from intensely humanised to untouched, why don't we add a second axis? So if we've got our x-axis of material factors representing degrees of modification, degrees of impact, why not a y-axis, which is cultural, representing human connection to country, cultural importance? Now, I don't delude myself that conceptualising Indigenous burning in this way is in any way the final word, but I'm trying to play around with this as a useful heuristic to reframe the fundamental flaws with grand unified theories, such as those from Gammage and Flannery. A landscape did not have to be burned or burned in an identical fashion for it to be a cultural landscape. We heard a bit about cultural landscapes last night. For instance, Gammage argues 5 features mark 1788 fire, Indigenous burning as he describes it. It was planned, it was precise, it could be repeated and therefore predicted, it was organised locally, and it was universal. Of these 5 features, it's only the last one, that universality, that's disputed by most of Gammage's many critics. As I very briefly mentioned above, debates over megafaunal extinction have begun to move past a simplistic climate-human binary. maybe, just maybe, an XY spectrum might help move Indigenous burning scholarship and Indigenous burning public debate past those similar binaries. So to conclude, the increased public and political interest in Indigenous burning practices, I think, means it's absolutely critical to create robust intellectual models which depict them. The model proposed in the biggest estate on Earth has been highly influential, but it suffers from the foundational flaw that it's based on a premise of pre-colonisation Australia as either entirely natural or entirely cultural. In this way, and in others, particularly in how it appeals to powerful tropes and how it can be politically mobilised, I argue that it's a grand unified theory of Indigenous environmental impact, similar to the Pleistocene megafaunal extinction theories. Conceiving of it as such allows us to imagine different intellectual models and heuristics, ones which will hopefully lead to more ecologically robust and culturally beneficial outcomes. Thank you.